She came to the lighthouse to escape her voice. The sea kept turning, indifferent to her silence. Inside the walls, a diary waited in the dark. Some truths outlive the people who couldn't speak them. Have you ever hidden words you should have said? The lighthouse stood like a memory at the edge of the world. Kyle arrived at dusk, when the sky bled gray into the sea. The beam swept wide across the water, slow and deliberate. She carried one suitcase and a need to disappear. The gravel path crunched beneath her boots. Salt hung thick in the air, sharp and metallic, clinging to her throat. She stopped at the door. Paint flaking, hinges red with rust, and pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was cold, solid, real, the kind of real she hadn't felt in months. Inside, the air was different. Stale, but not dead, like a room holding its breath. Dust spiraled in the last light streaming through salt-streaked windows. The walls were stone, thick and weathered, and every sound she made, the scrape of her shoe, the drop of her bag, echoed back louder than it should have. The lighthouse had been abandoned for 6 years. No neighbors, no cell signal, just wind, gulls, and the rhythmic groan of the rotating light mechanism overhead. She climbed the spiral staircase, one hand trailing along the cold iron rail. The stairs were narrow, steep, winding upward into shadow. At the top, the keeper's room waited. A desk, a chair, a narrow bed with a bare mattress. One window facing the sea. She stood there for a long time, watching the beam slice through the gathering dark over and over, patient and indifferent. This was what she'd wanted. Silence, distance. A place where no one could ask her questions she didn't know how to answer. A place where the only voice she'd hear was her own. Or maybe not even that. She'd left behind a life that had become too loud, too full of people who expected things from her she couldn't give. The lighthouse was a self-imposed exile. She told herself it was temporary. She didn't believe it. She set her suitcase on the floor and opened it. Clothes, a few books, a photograph she kept face down. She didn't unpack. Not yet. Instead, she moved to the desk, running her fingers along the scarred wood. Someone had worked here, lived here, left marks. There was a mug, long empty, a ring of dried coffee staining the bottom, a rusted tin of matches, and a logbook. It sat in the center of the desk, pages yellowed and warped at the edges. She lifted it carefully, felt the weight of it in her hands. The cover was cracked leather, soft with age. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was cramped, deliberate. Each letter formed with care, as if the act of writing itself mattered more than speed. Dates, weather patterns, tide times, routine entries tracking the rhythm of the sea. She flipped forward, scanning pages. The entries grew sparser as the years went on. Fewer notes, longer gaps. And then, 6 years ago, they stopped. The last entry read, beam rotation irregular, fixed, storm expected by morning. Nothing after that, just blank pages waiting. Kyle closed the book slowly and set it back on the desk. She didn't know why, but her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the strange intimacy of reading someone's last words without knowing they were the last. The beam passed over her window. She turned, watching the light sweep across the room, illuminating dust, shadow, the shape of her own silhouette against the glass. For a moment, she felt seen, not haunted, not watched by something malicious, just noticed. Like the lighthouse itself was acknowledging her presence, like it had been waiting. She moved to the small kitchen alcove. A single counter, a sink stained with rust, a 2-burner stove that looked older than she was. She found a candle in a drawer, half melted, and lit it with one of the matches from the tin. The flame wavered, then steadied. The smell of wax filled the room, warm and faintly sweet, cutting through the salt and dust. Outside, the wind picked up. She heard the gulls crying, distant and sharp, the rhythmic groan of the light mechanism overhead, turning, turning, turning. The sound was almost soothing, predictable. She realized she hadn't heard predictable in a long time. She sat at the desk, the candle flickering beside her, and opened the logbook again. This time she didn't read the entries. She just held it. Felt the texture of the pages, the weight of someone else's routine, someone else's solitude. She wondered who they were, why they'd left, whether they'd been running too. The beam swept past again. The room went dark, then bright, then dark. She closed her eyes and listened to the sea below, crashing, pulling back, crashing again. A rhythm older than the lighthouse, older than her, older than what she was running from. She didn't know yet what she'd find here, but for the first time in months she felt like maybe she could breathe. The first 3 days passed in motion. Cale woke with the light when the beam stopped turning and the sun began to rise over the water. She didn't set an alarm. She didn't need one. The rhythm of the lighthouse was enough. She cleaned. Not because the space was unbearable, but because the act itself was soothing. Repetition. Control. She scrubbed salt from the windows until the glass was clear enough to see the horizon without distortion. She oiled the hinges on the door until they stopped groaning. She replaced burnt-out bulbs in the stairwell, one by one, climbing and descending until her legs ached and her hands smelled like metal and dust. It felt good, purposeful, like she was earning the space, paying rent to the past in small acts of restoration. The logbook stayed on the desk. She passed it every time she moved through the keeper's room, and each time she felt the pull to open it again. Sometimes she did. She'd read an entry or two. Notes about wind speed, visibility, the occasional ship passing in the night. The handwriting never changed. Steady, careful, the kind of writing that came from someone who had time and chose to use it deliberately. On the second day, she found a rusted compass in the drawer beneath the desk. The glass was cracked, the needle stuck pointing northeast, but when she held it in her palm, it felt warm, like it had been waiting. She set it on the windowsill next to the candle. In the kitchen alcove, she discovered a tin of tea, the leaves so old they'd hardened into a solid mass. She pried the lid open, and the smell hit her immediately. Bergamot. Faint, but unmistakable. She wondered if the keeper had drunk it every morning, standing at the window, watching the light fade into day. She wondered if they'd been alone by choice or circumstance. She found nautical charts rolled and tucked into a wooden crate near the staircase. When she unrolled them, the paper crackled, brittle at the edges. The coastline was mapped in meticulous detail. Rocks, currents, shallow water marked in red ink. Someone had studied this place, lived inside its rhythms, understood its dangers. Everything she touched felt intentional, placed with care. A life lived deliberately, not desperately. On the third day, she spoke aloud for the first time. "Okay," she said, standing at the base of the spiral staircase, hands on her hips. "Let's see what else you're hiding." Her voice sounded strange in the space, too loud, too human, but it didn't echo back the way she expected. It just settled, like the lighthouse absorbed it. She climbed the stairs slowly, running her hand along the stone wall. Halfway up, she noticed a panel that looked slightly off. The wood darker, the edges uneven. She pressed her palm against it. It shifted, just a little, loose. She hesitated, then pushed harder. The panel gave way, sliding inward, with a dry scrape. Behind it, a hollow space, and inside that space, a book. She reached in carefully, her fingers brushing leather, cool and soft, worn smooth by time. She pulled it free and held it in both hands, her heart beating faster than it should have. It was smaller than the logbook, more personal, a diary. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same. Cramped, deliberate, unmistakable. But the words were different. To whoever finds this, I couldn't say these things when it mattered. Maybe silence is easier than truth. Kyle stood there for a long time, the diary open in her hands, the stairwell dim and cold around her. She didn't know what to feel. Curiosity, yes, but also something heavier, like she'd been given permission to trespass, like she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She closed the diary and carried it upstairs. That night, the lighthouse beam flickered. Just once. Just enough to notice. Kyle was sitting at the desk, the diary in front of her, unopened. The beam swept past the window, stuttered, then continued. She told herself it was electrical. Old wiring, nothing more. But the air felt different, heavier, like the building was holding its breath. Like it knew she'd found something she wasn't supposed to. She lit the candle. The flame wavered, casting shadows that moved wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. She picked up the diary and opened it again. This time she turned the page. The first entry was dated 12 years ago. The handwriting was steady, but the words weren't. I saw her today. I wanted to tell her. I didn't. Kyle exhaled slowly. She didn't know who her was. Didn't know the keeper's name, or why they'd hidden this, or what silence had cost them. But she understood the feeling. The weight of words unsaid. The safety of distance. The fear that speaking might break something you couldn't repair. She turned another page, then another. The entries were short. Fragments. Moments captured and buried. She brought flowers. I said thank you. I didn't say the rest. 10 years in this lighthouse. 10 years of wanting to speak. 10 years of choosing not to. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe love is easier when it stays quiet. Kyle closed the diary and set it down. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from recognition. Outside the sea roared. The beam turned. The wind pressed against the glass. And somewhere in the walls, the lighthouse groaned. Soft, low, inevitable. She picked up the diary again. This time she didn't stop reading. She read through the night, not all of it. The diary wasn't long, maybe 60 pages, and many were blank. But what was there felt vast, heavy. Like each entry carried more weight than the words themselves could hold. The keeper's name was Oren. She learned that in the third entry, written casually, almost as an afterthought. 12 years at Vale Point. 12 years, and I still don't know if I chose this place or if it chose me. Oren. He wrote about the sea, the way fog rolled in, so thick you couldn't see the rocks below, the way light cut through it, sharp and clean, like the world was being born again every morning. He wrote about the isolation, not with bitterness, but with something closer to reverence, like solitude was a gift he'd been given and didn't want to waste. But between the lines, Kale felt something else. Loneliness, longing, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just seeps into every sentence, quiet and persistent. She turned the page. Her hands were cold. The candle had burned low, wax pooling at the base, and the beam outside kept turning, steady and indifferent. Misa visited today, brought bread and asked if I needed anything from town. I said no. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say stay. M. The letter appeared again, 2 pages later. then again, then again, always brief, always restrained. M laughed at something I said. I didn't realize I could still make someone laugh. She stayed for tea. We talked about nothing. It felt like everything. I wanted to tell her. I didn't. Kyle read the words aloud without meaning to. Soft. Testing them in her own voice. They felt familiar. Too familiar. She closed the diary and pressed her palms flat against the desk, trying to slow her breathing. She recognized this. The paralysis. The careful distance. The belief that silence was safer than honesty. That wanting something didn't mean you deserved to ask for it. She'd come to the lighthouse for the same reason Oren had stayed. To hide. To wait. To let the noise of the world fade until all that was left was the sound of the sea and the turning of the light. She opened the diary again. This time she didn't stop. The entries spanned years. Oren never used M's full name, never explained who she was or why she visited. But the pattern was clear. She came every few weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. And every time, Oren wrote about her the way people write about weather, inevitable, beautiful, beyond control. M asked if I was lonely. I lied. She said I should come to town more often. I said maybe. I won't. 10 years in this lighthouse, 10 years of wanting to speak, 10 years of choosing not to. Cale's throat tightened. She set the diary down and stood, moving to the window. The beam swept past, illuminating the water below. Dark, restless, endless. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and exhaled slowly. Her breath fogged the surface, then faded. She'd left someone behind too, not in the same way, not with the same silence, but close enough. Close enough that reading Oren's words felt like looking into a mirror she'd been avoiding for months. She returned to the desk, turned another page, and stopped. A photograph had slipped free from between the pages, landing face up on the desk. She picked it up carefully, holding it by the edges. A woman, standing at the lighthouse door, smiling. She was younger than Kyle expected, maybe in her 40s when the photo was taken. Dark hair pulled back, eyes warm. She held a wicker basket in one hand, and the sunlight behind her made her look like she was glowing. Cale turned the photograph over, writing on the back, written in Oren's careful handwriting. Marith, 2018. Marith. Cale stared at the name. M. Not a stranger, not a symbol. A real person. Someone who'd stood where Cale was standing now. Someone who'd brought bread and tea and laughter into this cold, isolated place. Someone Oren had loved and never told. She sat back down, the photograph still in her hand, and opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi was weak but functional. She typed the name into the search bar. Marith. Vile Point. Lighthouse. It took less than a minute to find her. A local directory listing, a phone number, an address in the village 20 minutes south along the coast. Still there. Still close. Cal closed the laptop slowly. Her heart was beating too fast. She didn't know what she'd expected. Maybe that M had moved away, or passed, or disappeared into the same silence Oren had. But she was real. Alive 20 minutes away. She looked down at the diary, then at the photograph, then back at the window where the beam kept turning. The lighthouse felt different now. Not empty, not waiting, just watching. She picked up the diary again and read the next entry. She asked me once if I believed in second chances. I said yes. I didn't tell her I'd already missed mine. Cale closed the book and stood. She didn't know what she was going to do yet. But she knew she couldn't stay still anymore. Something had shifted. Something had pulled tight inside her, like a rope she didn't know she was holding until it started to move. She walked to the window and looked out at the water. The beam swept past. Once, twice, 3 times. She whispered to the glass, to the room, to the past that was still here. Who was she to you? The lighthouse didn't answer, but the wind outside picked up, and somewhere below, the sea crashed harder against the rocks. She drove to the village the next morning. The photograph sat in her passenger seat, face up. Mareth's smile caught in sunlight that no longer existed. Kyle kept glancing at it, checking, like the image might change if she looked away too long. The road hugged the coast. On her left, the sea stretched flat and gray under low clouds. On her right, hills rose steep and green, dotted with stone cottages and wooden fences that looked older than the roads themselves. She passed a church, a pub, a general store with faded paint, and a bench out front where 2 men sat drinking coffee, watching her car pass with the kind of attention that came from knowing everyone who belonged and noticing everyone who didn't. She found Mareth's house at the end of a narrow lane, small, whitewashed, a garden out front with roses climbing the fence, their blooms heavy and starting to fade. Kyle parked and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. Her heart was beating too fast. She didn't know what she was going to say, didn't know if she had the right to say anything at all. She picked up the photograph and got out of the car. Mareth answered on the second knock. She was older than in the photograph. 60, maybe more. But her eyes were the same. Warm. Careful. She looked at Cale with the kind of wariness that came from too many strangers showing up with questions. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft, measured. Cale held up the photograph. "I found this, at the lighthouse. I think you knew the man who lived there." Mareth's face changed, not immediately, just a slow shift, recognition, then something heavier, grief maybe, or memory that felt too close to touch. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." Inside, the house smelled like tea and wood smoke. The walls were lined with photographs. Family, friends, moments caught and framed. Kyle followed Mareth into a small kitchen, where sunlight poured through lace curtains, soft and diffused. Mareth gestured to a chair at the table. Cale sat. Mareth stood by the counter for a moment, her back to Cale, hands braced against the edge. Then she turned and sat across from her. "Oren was my brother," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She folded them on the table. "Younger, by 3 years. He lived at that lighthouse for 12 years. Died 6 years ago." Cale nodded slowly. "I found his diary, hidden in the wall." Mareth exhaled, not surprised, just resigned. "He told me he was going to leave it there. Said maybe someone would find it someday. Someone who'd understand." She looked at Cale then, really looked. "Did you?" "I think so," Cale said quietly. "He wrote about someone. I thought that was you." Mareth smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It was. For a while. But then it wasn't." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "He was writing about Asla, my best friend. He loved her. For years. He never told her." Kyle felt something tighten in her chest. "Why not?" "Because she was engaged," Mareth said simply. "To a good man. A kind man. Oren didn't think he had the right to say anything. Didn't think it would be fair. So he just stayed quiet. Stayed at the lighthouse. Watched her get married. Watched her move away. And wrote letters he never sent." The room felt smaller suddenly. Kyle's hands were cold. "What happened to her?" Mareth's face softened, but the grief in it deepened. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer. It was quick. She didn't suffer much, they said." She looked down at her hands. Oren came to the funeral. Stood in the back. Didn't speak to anyone. I found him afterward, sitting in his car, just staring. I asked if he was all right. He said yes, but I knew he wasn't. Kyle's throat felt tight. When did he? 6 months later, Marith said. Heart failure, officially, but I think it was grief. I think he'd been holding on for so long, and when she was gone, there was nothing left to hold on to. She looked up at Cale. He left the diary in the wall on purpose. He wanted someone to read it, to know what silence cost him. Kyle couldn't speak, couldn't move. The words sat heavy in her chest, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Marith stood and walked to a cupboard near the door. She opened it and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth at the edges. She carried it back to the table and set it down between them. These are his, she said. Letters. He wrote them to Isla over the years. Never sent a single one. I found them in his room after he died. I didn't know what to do with them. She pushed the box across the table toward Kyle. Maybe you will. Kyle stared at the box. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The wood was cool under her fingers, solid, real. Why are you giving them to me? She asked. Marith looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, because you came here, because you found his diary and you didn't just leave it in the wall, because I think you understand what it means to carry words you can't say. She paused. And maybe you'll do what he couldn't. Kyle left the house 20 minutes later, the box of letters cradled against her chest. Marith stood in the doorway, watching her go, one hand raised in a small, tired wave. Kyle got into her car and set the box on the passenger seat next to the photograph. She started the engine, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. Her vision blurred. She pressed her palms against her eyes and tried to breathe. And then, for the first time since arriving at the lighthouse, she cried. Not for Oren, not for Isla. For herself, for the person she'd left behind, for the words she'd never said, for the silence she'd chosen, because it felt safer than truth. She cried until her chest ached and her breath came ragged and uneven. And when she finally stopped, when the tears dried and the world came back into focus, she looked at the box of letters and understood. This wasn't just Oren's story. It was hers. She drove back to the lighthouse in silence. No radio, no open windows, just the hum of the engine and the weight of the box on the seat beside her. The road felt longer this time, like the distance between the village and Vale Point had stretched while she was gone. When she arrived, the lighthouse looked the same. Stone, solid, indifferent. But it felt different, like it had been waiting for her to come back with the truth. She carried the box inside and set it on the desk next to the diary. For a long time, she just stood there, staring at it. The wood was dark, almost black in the places where hands had touched it over the years. Oren's hands, Marith's, now hers. She sat down, opened the lid. The letters were bundled in stacks, tied with twine that had gone brittle with age. She lifted the first bundle carefully and untied it. The paper was thin, yellowed, covered in Oren's careful handwriting. She unfolded the first letter and began to read. Dear Isla, I saw you at the market today. You were buying apples. You were laughing at something the vendor said. I stood 3 stalls away and watched. I didn't come closer. I told myself it was because I didn't want to interrupt. But that's not true. The truth is I didn't know what to say. I never do. I hope you're happy. Oren. Kyle set the letter down. Her hands were shaking. She picked up another. Dear Isla, it's been 6 months since you got married. Marith says you're living in the city now, that you're happy. I'm glad. I am. I keep telling myself that. But at night, when the light turns and the sea is quiet, I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver. If I'd said something before it was too late. I hope you're happy. Oren. Another. Dear Isla, 10 years. I've been writing these letters for 10 years. I don't know why I keep doing it. You'll never read them. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's easier this way, to love someone from a distance, to keep the words safe where they can't hurt anyone. I hope you're happy. Oren. Kyle read through them all. 37 letters. 12 years of silence folded into paper and tied with string. Each one began the same. Each one ended the same. And in between, longing, specificity, the ache of watching someone live a life you weren't part of and pretending that was enough. She set the last letter down and pressed her palms flat against the desk. Her chest felt tight. Her throat burned. Oren hadn't just loved Isla. He'd studied her, memorized her, built a version of her in his mind out of stolen glances, and overheard conversations and the shape of her laugh from across a room. And he'd carried that love in silence until it killed him. Cal thought about the person she'd left behind, the words she'd never said, the distance she'd chosen because it felt safer than honesty. She'd told herself it was for the best, that some things were better left unspoken. That silence was a kindness, but it wasn't. It was just fear dressed up as consideration. Maybe silence isn't safety. Maybe it's just the slow architecture of regret. If you've ever stood at the edge of something you couldn't say, I'll be here, telling stories like this every week. Subscribe, because some truths don't get easier with time. She stood and climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse. The keeper's room was cold. The beam turned overhead, casting light across the dark water in slow, sweeping arcs. She carried the letters with her and stood at the window, watching. The light kept moving. The words had stayed still. For a moment, she considered it, burning them, letting the letters turn to ash and scatter into the sea, erasing the evidence of Oren's silence as if that might undo what it had cost him. But she didn't, because that's what he'd done his whole life, kept the truth hidden, kept it safe. And it hadn't saved him. It had buried him. She set the letters on the desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. Her hand hovered over it for a long time. Then she began to write. I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I'll send it. But I need to say it anyway, even if it's just to the air, even if it's just to prove to myself that I can. She wrote slowly, deliberately, the way Oren had written. But where his words had stayed hidden, hers would go out into the world. She didn't know what would happen after that. Didn't know if it would fix anything. But at least it would be said. At least it would be true. She wrote through the night, and when she was finished, when the sky outside began to lighten, and the beam overhead slowed to a stop, she folded the letter and set it beside Oren's. 2 people, 2 silences, one breaking. The lighthouse groaned softly, the way old buildings do when they settle. Kyle closed her eyes and listened to the sea below. It sounded different now, not threatening, not indifferent, just constant. She picked up her letter and held it against her chest. Her heart was beating too fast. Her hands were cold, but she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Ready. She waited until morning, not because she needed the light, but because what she was about to do felt too fragile for darkness, too sacred for the turning beam and the groaning walls. It needed daylight, witness, the world awake. She folded her letter carefully, the creases sharp and deliberate. Then she gathered Oren's letters, all 37 of them, tied in their brittle twine, and placed them in the box. She carried both down the spiral staircase, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have. At the door, she paused, looked back at the keeper's room. The desk, the logbook still open to Oren's last entry. The candle burned down to nothing. She didn't say goodbye. She just left. The drive to the village felt different this time. The road didn't stretch. The hills didn't loom. The sea on her left was gray but calm, its surface smooth as glass. She kept her hands steady on the wheel, her letter folded in her jacket pocket, the box of orange letters on the seat beside her. When she reached the post office, she sat in the car for a long time. Her heart was beating too fast. Her hands were cold. She looked down at the letter in her lap and read the first line again. I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I'll send it, but I need to say it anyway. She'd written it. That part was done. But sending it, that was different. That was irrevocable. Once the letter left her hands, there was no taking it back. No pretending she hadn't said what she'd said. No safety in silence anymore. She thought about Oren. 12 years of letters tied with string and hidden in a box. 12 years of wanting to speak and choosing not to. 12 years of calling that love. But it wasn't love. It was fear. And she was done being afraid. She got out of the car, the letter clutched tight in her hand, and walked into the post office. The woman behind the counter looked up, smiled politely, asked if she needed help. Kyle set the letter on the counter. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I need to mail this. The woman weighed it, applied the stamp, dropped it into the bin behind her. Just like that. Gone. Done. Sent. Kyle stood there for a moment, staring at the empty counter. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, from release, like she'd been holding her breath for months and had finally exhaled. She drove to Mareth's house next. The roses in the garden were still heavy, still fading. Mareth answered the door, wearing the same careful expression as before. Warm but wary. When she saw Cale holding the box, her expression changed. You read them, she said quietly. Cale nodded. All of them. Mareth stepped back, opened the door wider. Cale followed her into the kitchen. The sunlight was softer this time, diffused through clouds. Mareth gestured to the table. Cale set the box down between them. I mailed my letter, Cale said. The one I wrote, to the person I left behind. She paused, her fingers resting on the edge of the box. I think you should give these to Isla's daughter. She should know her mother was loved, that someone saw her and remembered. Mareth's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her hand reaching across the table to touch the box. She lives in the city. I haven't spoken to her in years, but I'll find her. I'll make sure she knows. Cale exhaled slowly. He wanted someone to read them, to understand what silence cost him. Maybe she needs to know that too. Mareth looked at her then, really looked. What did it cost you? Kyle's throat tightened. She thought about the person she'd left behind, the words she'd never said, the months she'd spent at the Lighthouse, hiding in beautiful isolation and calling it healing. But it wasn't healing. It was just fear dressed up as self-preservation. Everything, she said quietly. Until now. Mareth reached across the table and squeezed her hand once. Firm. Grounding. Then she let go. Kyle stood. Mareth walked her to the door. Before she left, Mareth said, You did something he couldn't. You spoke. Kyle nodded. I had to. I couldn't live his story. She drove back to the lighthouse as the afternoon light began to soften. The beam was stilled, waiting for dusk. She parked and walked to the edge of the cliff, looking out at the water. The wind picked up, colder now, sharper. It smelled like rain. She stood there for a long time, hands in her pockets, eyes on the horizon. The letter was gone. Oren's letters were gone. The silence was broken, and she felt lighter, not healed, not whole, but no longer buried. Behind her, the lighthouse stood solid and indifferent. The beam would turn again when night came. It always did. But the words that had stayed still for 12 years were finally moving. She turned and walked back inside. The keeper's room felt different now. Emptier, but not hollow. Just open. Like something had been released and the space was still adjusting to the absence. She sat at the desk and closed the logbook. Ran her fingers over the worn leather one last time. Then she stood, walked to the window, and watched the sea. The wind rattled the glass. The clouds moved fast overhead. And somewhere, far away, her letter was traveling towards the person she'd left behind. She didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if they'd read it. Didn't know if it would change anything. But she knew she'd said it, and that was enough. The days after felt longer, not heavier. Just slower, like time had stretched to make room for everything she'd set in motion. She didn't wait for a response. Didn't check her phone every hour or stand by the mailbox hoping for something to arrive. She'd said what she needed to say. What happened next wasn't hers to control. Instead, she walked. Long, wandering paths along the cliffs, where the wind pulled at her hair and the sea stretched out gray and endless below. The lighthouse stood behind her, its beam turning through the fog each night, steady and indifferent. She didn't think about Orrin as much anymore. Didn't feel haunted by his silence. Just grateful. For the diary, for the letters, for the warning he'd left behind. She spent hours in the keeper's chair, watching the light sweep across the water. The mechanism groaned softly overhead, familiar now, almost comforting. The logbook stayed closed on the desk. She'd considered taking it with her when she left, whenever that would be, but decided against it. It belonged here, part of the lighthouse's memory, part of the stone and salt and endless turning light. On the 5th day, Meredith came to visit. Cale heard the knock and opened the door to find her standing on the gravel path, a basket in her hands, her expression softer than it had been before. Cale stepped aside. Meredith came in without a word and set the basket on the counter. Bread, tea, a jar of honey. "You don't have to keep bringing me things," Kyle said quietly. Meredith smiled. "I know, but I want to." They sat at the small table by the window, cups of tea warming their hands. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just present, like neither of them needed to fill it with words. Finally, Meredith spoke. "I found Isla's daughter. Gave her the letters." Kyle looked up. Her chest tightened. "And?" "She wept. Meredith said simply. "For hours, I think. She didn't know. Had no idea Orrin felt that way about her mother. She thought he was just a family friend. Someone who came to the funeral out of obligation." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "She thanked me. Thanked you. Said it changed the way she saw her mother. Made her feel seen. Loved in a way she hadn't understood before." Kale exhaled slowly. She didn't realize she'd been holding her breath. "He would have wanted that," she said. "I think so too," Meredith replied. They sat in silence again. Then Meredith looked at her, eyes steady and kind. "What about you? Have you heard anything?" Kyle shook her head. "No. And I don't know if I will. Does that scare you?" Kyle thought about it, turned the question over in her mind like a stone in her palm. "No," she said, finally. "Not anymore. I said what I needed to say. Whether they read it, whether they respond, that's not mine to carry." She looked out the window at the sea. Orrin's story didn't need a happy ending. It just needed to be told. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It just buries us alive. Meredith reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Once, firm, then let go. After Meredith left, Cale climbed to the top of the lighthouse. The sun was setting. the sky bruised with purples and grays. The beam hadn't started turning yet. It waited for full dark. She stood at the window and watched the light fade over the water. The waves rolled in, steady and constant. The wind rattled the glass. And somewhere, far away, her words were moving through the world. Maybe being read. Maybe being folded and set aside. Maybe being held close to someone's chest the way she'd held Oren's letters. She didn't know. And that was okay. The light doesn't chase anything, she thought. It just keeps moving. Steady. Inevitable. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need answers. It just turns. She sat down in the keeper's chair and closed her eyes. The wind howled outside. The mechanism groaned to life overhead. The beam began to sweep across the water, cutting through the dusk, over and over, patient and relentless. She thought about the person she'd written to. Wondered if they were reading her words right now. Wondered if they were angry or relieved or heartbroken. Wondered if they'd ever write back. She hoped they would, but she could live with it if they didn't. Because she'd done the thing Oren never could. She'd spoken. She'd sent the words into the world instead of hiding them in a wall. And whether or not they changed anything, whether or not they were received the way she hoped, she'd tried. She'd been honest. She'd refused to bury herself alive. That had to be enough. The beam turned. The sea crashed below. The sky deepened to black. And Kyle sat in the keeper's chair, eyes open now, watching the light move across the water. Not waiting for anything. Not running from anything. Just here. Present. Alive. The lighthouse groaned softly, the way old buildings do when they settle into night. She reached out and touched the wall beside her. The stone was cold and solid under her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. The lighthouse didn't answer, but the beam kept turning, and that felt like enough. She woke to soft light. Not the beam. That had stopped hours ago. This was morning, pale and gentle, filtering through the salt-streaked glass, turning the keeper's room gold at the edges. She lay still for a moment, listening. The sea was calm. The wind had dropped. The lighthouse was silent except for the creak of old wood settling and the distant cry of gulls circling the cliffs. She got up slowly, dressed, and walked outside. The air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of salt and wet stone. The path to the lighthouse was overgrown with wild grass and weeds, tough and stubborn in the thin soil. She stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then she walked back inside and found a pair of gardening gloves in the cupboard beneath the stairs. Meredith had left them weeks ago, along with a small trowel and a packet of wildflower seeds. She knelt at the edge of the path and began to dig. The soil was rocky and hard, but she worked slowly, loosening the earth, clearing space. She planted the seeds one by one, pressing them gently into the ground, covering them with soil and patting it down with her palms. She didn't know if they'd grow, didn't know if she'd be here long enough to see them bloom. But that didn't matter. She was planting them anyway. Meredith arrived an hour later, carrying a watering can and a soft smile. She didn't ask what Kale was doing. She just knelt beside her and started planting too. They worked in silence. No words. Just the sound of earth being turned, seeds being buried, hands moving in rhythm. When they finished, Meredith stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. Kyle did the same. "Will you stay?" Meredith asked. Kale looked at the lighthouse. Solid, weathered, no longer haunted, just present. She thought about the letters she'd been writing, not just the ones she'd sent, but the others. To people she'd hurt, to people she missed. She didn't know if she'd send them all, but she was learning to speak, learning to live with her voice out loud instead of buried. "For a while," she said. "Not because I'm hiding, because I'm choosing to." Marith nodded. That's different. Yes, Cale said. It is. Marith left soon after, waving from the gravel path. Cal stood at the door and watched her go. Then she turned and walked back inside. She climbed the stairs to the keeper's room and sat at the desk. The logbook was still there, closed. The candle had burned down to nothing. She opened the drawer and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. Not for a letter this time. Just words, thoughts. The kind of writing that wasn't for anyone but herself. She wrote about Oren, about Isla, about the cost of silence and the weight of speaking. She wrote about the person she'd left behind, and the letter she'd sent, and the uncertainty she'd learned to carry without letting it bury her. She wrote until her hand ached, and the light outside had shifted from gold to white to the soft gray of afternoon. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked out the window. The flowers weren't visible yet. They were still seeds, still buried, still waiting, but she knew they were there, and that was enough. She thought about Oren again, not with grief this time, just understanding. He'd loved Isla the only way he knew how, from a distance, in silence, with words that never reached her. It wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. Love isn't always about being together. Sometimes it's about being honest, about letting someone know they mattered, even if the timing was wrong or the outcome uncertain. Oren had loved Isla by letting her go, by not disrupting her life, by carrying his silence like a gift. But Cale was learning something different. She was learning to love herself by finally showing up, by speaking, by refusing to let fear decide what she was allowed to say. She stood and walked to the window. The lighthouse beam was still, waiting for dusk. The sea stretched out calm and gray. The wind moved through the grass, soft and steady. She lit a candle and set it on the windowsill. Not for Oren, not for Isla, not for the person she'd written to, but for herself. For the words finally spoken, for the silence finally broken, for the life she was choosing to live out loud. The candle flickered, then steadied, the flame small but constant. She thought about the beam, about how it turned every night, sweeping light across the water, whether anyone was watching or not. It didn't wait for permission. It didn't need validation. It just moved, steady, inevitable. We all carried lighthouses inside us, she thought. Some of us just forget to turn them on. But the light is always there, waiting, ready, inevitable. She looked out at the sea one last time. The waves kept their rhythm. The gulls circled. The wildflower seeds waited beneath the soil. And Cale stood at the window, candle burning beside her, and didn't flinch at the sound.